The new Grail is the best gravel bike Canyon has ever made. Melding tremendous handling, a comfortable ride, useful integration and thoughtful accessories, it is in fact the best gravel race bike I have ever ridden. And it looks great. I've been testing the third tier Canyon Grail CFR Di2. At £6,699 with US pricing to be confirmed, it is not exactly a barnstorming bargain. However, when compared to competitor bikes of the same price, this build actually packs a bit of a punch. As ever, moving towards more mid-tier prices presents far better value for money, and at the end of this video, I'm going to reveal my choice from the new Canyon Grail range. Now, if you want to read my full review or the news story on the design of the bike, head to the links in the video description below. Now, before we get stuck into what this bike is actually like to ride, we've got to get one thing out the way. The Hoverbar is dead. Derided as daft by naysayers or beloved by believers, there have been few products in cycling as divisive as the Canyon Hoverbar. Unlike every other drop bar in existence, where the stem clamps onto a clamping area in the middle of the bar, the Hoverbar instead connected to a secondary bar connecting to the hooks. The Hoverbar defined the original Grail, with Canyon claiming it provided additional front-end compliance without the hassle of suspension, with the added benefit of additional useful hand positions. It also generated absolutely loads of headlines and memes, planting Canyon firmly on the gravel cycling map. If a marketing coup was Canyon's intention, the bars worked as intended, but in reality they had many practical drawbacks. Recognizing these drawbacks, Canyon has sent the CP01 gravel carbon handlebar hovering up to the heavens, where it will spend the rest of its days with other ill-fated cycling tech. In its place is the altogether more vanilla double drop bar, a fairly conventional one-piece cockpit with some clever shaping to improve off-road comfort, but we'll come on to that later. In the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts on the original Hoverbar. Will you mourn the loss of this iconic bit of cycling tech, or are you glad to see the back of the Sopwith Camel of cycling handlebars? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Back to the new Grail, and we're going to get started with the geometry, because it's the key talking point behind this bike, and I think the main reason for why it is so damn good. Canyon says he wanted to build on the already stable ride of the original Grail, improving high-speed handling while remaining agile. And in summary, they've nailed it. The new bike is stable, sure-footed and calm at high speeds. It snowplows through rattly gravel roads, but also climbs calmly with no desire to wander side to side when you're honking on the bars. That stability does mean it takes a little bit more forethought to, for example, dodge a last-minute puddle, but it's not exactly like the bike is treacly or unreactive. That effect is less pronounced at slow speeds. When climbing steppy or technical terrain, the bike feels amply capable. It's very easy to shift weight fore and aft and lift that rear end when required. The seated pedaling position is also superb. So what's going on here? What special sauce have Canyon poured all over the Grail to make it such a compelling ride? Now, no one figure defines any bike's geometry, but if we compare the Grail to its contemporaries, a few things stand out. To start, the wheelbase of the Grail is 27mm longer than the old Grail, standing at 1080mm for this size large bike. That is notably long for a go-fast gravel race bike. I obviously can't say with 100% certainty, but taking the pulse of similar bikes, only sort of pseudo-mountain bikes like the YT Scepter are longer than the Grail. Digging deeper into the figures, you'll note that the Trek Checkpoint, the Specialized Crux and the Villiers Rave, which were all part of that test last year, have basically the same chainstay lengths as this bike, despite it being so much longer. Without boring you to death with too much in terms of geometry, the important thing here is that the front center of the bike is pretty long, and that's the distance from the bottom bracket to the front axle. This, in part, explains why the bike doesn't feel as sluggish as a quick glance at the geometry chart would suggest. Long chainstays can be good in some circumstances, but generally speaking, shorter chainstays as seen here will make a bike feel more reactive. The ride position is also appropriate for a gravel race bike. As you can see here, I have a few spacers underneath the stem, but even then, I have a small amount of saddle to bar drop. However, if you did want an aggressive position, you could remove those spacers, slam the whole thing, get your bum up, and you'd look really pro. Now, geometry is a really complex subject, and I've only touched it very briefly here, but it's important to note that it is what makes this bike so good. While I personally think it's probably because they were bored of being bullied in the comments, Canyon says it killed off the Hoverbar because it wasn't very aero. Now that does make a certain amount of sense. With basically two handlebars in the front of your bike, well, there's two things flapping about in the wind. Now Canyon says the result of all of its learnings from the original Hoverbar is this, the new double drop bar. As you can see, the new double drop bar is a fairly conventional one-piece cockpit with some quite tasty shaping. It does make it especially good for riding off-road. To start, making the most of that long geometry, the stem is fairly short at 70mm long. Moving on to the tops, these are flattened but not overly broad as to give an uncomfortable hand position if you're riding for hours up there. Then, as we go into the ramps, these are slightly extended out to 70mm long, giving a useful hand position either on the hoods or, if you're sitting a little bit further back, on the corner before the ramps. Onto the hooks, and the bars then flare out really nicely, and the drops themselves are long enough as your big fat phalanges won't get smooshed up in an uncomfortable way. In testing, I really got on well with this bar. It melds lots of things I like to see in any drop bar, particularly those longer drops, but for off-road riding or perhaps longer rides, that gentle flare and a little bit of down sweep is just lovely. It puts your wrists in a really nice neutral position, and Canyon has clearly put a lot of work into designing this bar. Now my size large bike came with a 44cm wide bar. That's probably a little bit wider than I'd want if I was a serious gravel racer, but for fussy pros who like to be as slippery as possible, Canyon will also offer an aftermarket 40cm wide bar if you want to get nice and narrow. Now I have kind of generally mixed feelings about one-piece cockpits. On the one hand, they do look pretty cool, and if the fit does work for you, there are few disadvantages. However, we must acknowledge that if the fit isn't quite right for you, the hassle and expense of swapping to something different is considerable. Now in Canyon's defense, this bike does just use a standard round 1 1/8 steerer. In addition, while the hoses do pass through the headset top bearing, it's not really unusual these days, and Canyon's interpretation of an integrated cockpit is less hateful than some. As it does just use a 1 1/8 steerer, you can also use pretty much any aftermarket finishing kit you so wish. Regardless of what little old me thinks, we can't turn the tide. Integrated cockpits are here to stay, and that's that. Now, it would be easy to miss this at a glance, but this little slot could be one of the reasons why the Grail will be a great bike for so many riders. Dubbed the gear groove, this groovy little slot is where accessories, including an aero cockpit, would be mounted. Now the aero cockpit for this bike is borrowed directly from the Speedmax triathlon bike, with the pads at the base of the bars spaced slightly wider to better suit gravel riding. Aero bars aren't universally loved or permitted in gravel racing, but for ultra endurance events or even events where punters like me want to have a less hateful time, they are a must. Now I will caveat this by saying I haven't tested the new aero cockpit yet. However, by all accounts, the system does work well and the gear groove does look pretty adaptable. I have been promised the new aero cockpit, so I urge you to keep your eyes peeled for a new episode of Tech of the Month where I'll be giving you an overview of the cockpit and some other tasty accessories for this bike, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now I should stress the gear groove is only seen on the two top tier bikes. The CFSL models do not feature the gear groove. This does limit accessory options if you are buying a cheaper bike, but whether or not that affects you will largely depend on whether you actually want to use an aero cockpit or not. The other accessories, such as the computer mount, there's not really going to be much functional difference between them. Now in all seriousness, there are two accessories that go with the Grail which I'm genuinely excited about and I believe elevate the bike above the competition. Now the first of these, Be Still My Beating Heart. The Grail has optional, delicious, fully integrated mudguards. I am BikeRadar's dedicated #1 mudguard evangelist, and this makes me so happy. So few gravel race bikes, or race bikes in general, come with provision to fit mudguards, let alone mudguards that are actually designed to go with the bike. Now, if I was being really picky, I would have preferred the bike to be compatible with any old mudguard. However, I acknowledge that can be quite difficult from a design perspective, and it's good to see Canyon considering mudguards at all. Critically, tyre clearance is unaffected by fitting mudguards. That means you can still run a big old 42mm tyre under those mudguards and not get a wet bum. Now, the second accessory I think is worth talking about is Canyon's new patented fork sleeves. These are cargo mounts that you can take on and off the bike, sliding onto each fork leg and both featuring little 3-boss cage mounts, enabling you to carry either up to 3 kilograms of luggage or additional water on the legs of the fork. Now remember, the primary intention of this bike is as a gravel race bike. However, thoughtful accessories like these fork mounts and the mudguards mean it is much more adaptable than some of its contemporaries. There are some other fun accessories which I cover in the full news story, and again, link in the video description. The Aero Load System is the fancy marketing name that Canyon has given its down tube storage compartment. Now, I love integrated storage. Any gravel rider worth their salt will have an organically sourced, perfectly curated handlebar bag, but there's no denying that integrated storage is more convenient and neater. Now, I will beef on Canyon for a second here, because in their marketing pack for this bike, they make some quite spurious claims about the potential aero savings of this system versus just putting stuff in your jersey pocket. In all honesty, I couldn't give a monkey's about this. What I care about is the fact it's well designed, neat and quiet. Now, my bike came preloaded with all the accessories you can see here. However, stock bikes will only come with that little multi-tool, and I don't think that's a problem. The multi-tool is the only thing that's actually specific to this system, fitting in a nice little neat slot underneath the pump. I suspect that most riders will be able to fill the rest of the system up with stuff they already have. Now, this is actually another feature you won't get on the third tier CFSL bike, which I think is a bit of a shame. You can, of course, always just use a frame bag or the aforementioned very trendy handlebar bag, but it is really useful, and I would like to have seen it on the cheaper bikes. As a final thought on all of these accessories, it's very easy to deride them as just being marketing gumph or not really that useful. However, I feel they really elevate the bike against the competition. From my testing experience, they're all very well designed and make the bike more adaptable than many of its contemporaries and are worth talking about. Now on to every gravel cyclist's favourite subject and a core part of any gravel bike review: tyres and tyre clearance. Now, the Canyon Grail's tyre clearance tops out at 42mm wide, which is actually pretty narrow by contemporary gravel bike standards. Canyon said it limited the clearance to this for two main reasons. To start, Canyon says all of its pro riders demanded that the bike can accommodate road-sized chainrings. And the Canyon Grail can take chainrings up to 52 tooth wide on the outer and 36 tooth on the inner. If it were to increase tyre clearance while also maintaining that ability to fit the larger chainrings, Canyon would either have had to drop the chainstay or lengthen the chainstays, which of course would have impacted the handling of the bike. Canyon also says that 42mm is generally the absolute widest that racers tend to go in gravel races, and I would broadly agree with that point. Certainly for the gravel riding that I enjoy, in my experience, if I wanted anything larger than that, I'd probably ride a mountain bike. Most of the models in the Grail range are spec'd with these Schwalbe G1 RS tyres, and they are banging. The cornering lugs are also really widely spaced, and that centre tread doesn't cling onto any mud, so even in wet or sticky conditions, while they're not the grippiest, they are very predictable. Now, I did find them a tiny bit delicate in testing, and if this were my own bike, I'd add a bit more sealant in there and probably a tyre insert. But as a good all-rounder race tyre, I think these are a good shout. You will note that the VCLS seat post, that lovely leaf spring seat post, which has been on many of Canyon's gravel bikes, has gone with this bike, with Canyon instead moving to a D-shaped seat post, which is the same profile as the one introduced on the Endurace endurance road bike. Canyon says that it's moved to this design based on feedback from pro riders who didn't love the springy feel of the VCLS seat post. Now, in testing, this definitely isn't as springy and sort of compliant on really rough terrain as the old seat post, but it's pretty good. Now, I'm not a pro rider, but I don't think it's a bad change. This seat post isn't as comfortable as the old one, but it's not uncomfortable. It still reacts and flexes plenty on rough terrain. The seat clamp design is also completely inoffensive. I'm neither here nor there with integrated seat clamps. This one uses a really easy to torque Torx head. It didn't slip. It's a seat post clamp. It's fine. To conclude, the new Canyon Grail is a well-rounded gravel bike that is more adaptable than many of its competitors. The geometry is absolutely dialed and it is a joy to ride, but I wouldn't buy this one. To start, at £6,699, I can't afford it. But there are bikes elsewhere in the range which present much better value for money. If I was looking for a new gravel race bike tomorrow, I would be looking at the Canyon Grail CF SLX8 Di2, which looks almost every bit as good as this bike, but costs £4,999. Now that is still a lot of money, but you are getting all of the things which make this bike so good for a lot less cash. Most importantly, you're still getting that down tube storage and the gear groove on the cockpit. I do think it's a real shame these cheaper builds don't feature these. However, if you're not fussy about that integration or adaptability, I've no doubt that these bikes would delight. The important thing is the geometry and the wider adaptability of the new Grail platform is what makes it so good. And with all of that in mind, if I was in the market for a new gravel race bike, this would be at the top of my list. Now there's loads more details on the new Canyon Grail on BikeRadar.com, and those links are in the video description. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments about the bike, leave those down below. I love reading them and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you don't already, of course, subscribe to the BikeRadar YouTube channel and tickle the little bell icon, so every time we upload a new video, you'll get a saucy notification. Finally, if you want even more gravel bike content, check out this video.